morning. The reason I'm here is because a year ago, 2 days ago, my daughter Grace was murdered in a hospital in Appleton, Wisconsin. And we're going to share a little bit about Grace's life and how it happened, why it happened, and then some practical solutions and the solution that ultimately really matters right at the end. So I'm going to walk through a slideshow, and if we get done a little bit early, I'll take some questions. So these are some pictures of Grace. So the first one on the bottom left is her in the hunting cabin. She used to deer hunt with me, which is a pretty special time. The next one over is on our boat, then with her big brother Travis, and then my helper mowing lawn. And right above the lawn mowing is with my wife Cindy, and then our daughter Jessica, who is in the back of the room. So Grace came into existence. I've only told this story twice before, so you're going to get the third opportunity. So my wife and I were 39 years old, and a few years earlier, we found out that we were one of God's, and so we prayed to say, okay, what do you want to have happen? And so we decided to let God lead in the baby department. So we're 39 years old, we're approaching 20 years of marriage. So what does that look like? It means stopping abstinence. So that's how Grace came into existence 20 years ago. And once we made that decision, my wife with Jessica and our son Travis got pregnant pretty fast. So her name is Cindy, but in this context, she's fertile Myrtle. So about 5 minutes later, Grace was conceived. So Grace was very high functioning. Grace had Down syndrome. She was off the charts, I think, for 3 reasons. Number one is we never vaccinated her with any vaccines. Number 2, of course, the most important, God made her that way, but then we homeschooled from the beginning. And my wife did a fantastic job teaching Grace. She knew how to read and write. She played violin at Jessica and Adam's wedding. And I taught her how to drive a car. Oh, you're doing great.
Hi, Paul. I'm driving this car I bought from you.
The thing I miss the most about Grace is her sense of humor. So 2 weeks ago, I went through the bank drive-through, and the branch manager said, hi, her name is Tracy. And she said, do you remember when you brought Grace in here? I said, yeah, I remember. And she reminded me of the exact event. So when Grace turned 18, I took her to the branch that we do business with at the credit union, and we opened up a checking account. We had to get an ID so she could vote, and then we opened up a checking account, and then I wanted to get her a credit card. So then Tracy asked Grace, what would you like the limit on the credit card to be? And she said 30. And so Tracy said $30. And Grace said, no, 30,000. And so when I went through the drive-through, Tracy said, Grace had big dreams. And she did. She was fantastic. So this picture, so everybody's seen this picture, right? And so, of course, we all know what it means. But Grace got humor in a very unique way. So when Grace saw this sign for the first time, she said, Dad, look at that sign. And you got to remember, she got this. And she said, it means watch out for falling bikes. So we have to dive into the details, and this is not very fun to walk through, but we need to get through it so that everybody in this room is awake once you leave. These hospitals have become killing fields, and the evidence I'm going to show you will prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. So these next 3 slides are hard to read, but I want to summarize, and I'm going to just get to the last one. This is literally the doctor's report. For those of you who have never been in the hospital, what happens is a doctor writes a report for every single day that the person's in the hospital. And every doctor writes one that touches the person. So Grace was in the hospital 7 days. 22 doctors saw Grace. This report is from the COVID specialist. So Grace went into the hospital with COVID, low oxygen, and her oxygen level was only at 88, 89%, but unfortunately we perceived that as an emergency. So she ends up going into the hospital with low oxygen. We were told that she'll just be here 3-4 days on oxygen and a steroid and be released. Well, this is the first day doctor's report from the COVID expert. And of course, we don't get this live. This was after a records request. And in this first report, he mentions Grace has Down syndrome 4 times. In the 22 reports, they mention Grace had Down syndrome 36 different times. That becomes a real important piece of this story as we walk through it, because Down syndrome has no impact on the care whatsoever. So why mention it? He also mentioned in this report that we were following the frontline doctors' misinformation campaign twice. He mentioned that we were Christian twice. And then he mentioned last, and it's what's highlighted in number 8. I'm just going to read it for you word for word because you can't see it on the screen. He says, unfortunately, I think the patient probably would not be here if she has been fully vaccinated. So you can obviously see the bias just in the first report. And when you go through all of them, it stands out like a sore thumb. This is the timeline I put together from the doctor's reports of Grace's last day. So we're going to run through her last day, and I'll go on a number of rabbit trails as I walk through that, because there's a backstory to a number of these things. So her last day on this earth was October 13th, 2021. That day started at 8 o'clock in the morning for us, and it started with a phone call from the doctor. I was at home at this point with my wife, Cindy. I had been taken out by an armed guard 3 days earlier on October 10th. My daughter, Jessica, was now the replacement advocate, so she was in the room. We had 44 hours without advocacy. So when I was taken out, we had to hire an attorney to get a replacement advocate in. So that attorney negotiated against the hospital attorney so that we could have advocacy. I mean, that's insane in and of itself, but that's not the point that I want to get to. So 8 o'clock in the morning, the doctor called Cindy and I at home. And the purpose of his call was to ask us for the 5th time for a pre-authorization to put Grace on a ventilator, just in case. So just in case, as I learned subsequently as I studied the money trail, just in case means when the hospital decides that they need the money, because a ventilator should never be used for COVID. It's not a tool that ever makes sense for COVID. It's a tool in certain situations, but COVID has been labeled COVID pneumonia, and it gives a perspective that's incorrect. COVID pneumonia is the tissues in your lungs clotting. It's not a filling up of the lungs at all, which we have that connotation when we talk about pneumonia. It's not that whatsoever. So Grace never needed a ventilator. It was never an option that we considered other than the first time that they asked. So at that point, my mindset was set by President Trump when at the beginning of COVID, he said we had a ventilator shortage. So that was my mindset. And so on October 8th, which was the second day Grace was in the hospital, the doctor came in and said, you need to put your daughter on a ventilator in the next 2 hours. Fortunately, I asked him, what is that based on? And he told me, and I had them rerun the blood numbers, and Grace was fine. But at that point, I dug into what is going on with these ventilators so I could be educated. And I found out that ventilators have a 90% kill rate with COVID. So we knew we're not going to do this. In spite of that, the doctor had called us on October 12th, the evening before, talking through a ventilator, said he'll call us the next day in the morning to get our decision. So he did. 8 o'clock in the morning, we received that call. And we told him no for the 5th time now. And he instantly switched gears and said, your daughter had such a good day yesterday, we should work on nutrition. So Grace was malnourished at this point. The reason was because they wouldn't let me feed her, they wouldn't let Jess feed her, and the nurses only gave Grace a few protein shakes while she was there. In fact, the 44 hours that we were not in the room, they increased a sedation med called Precedex 7 different times. So instead of taking care of Grace, they sedated her. what I believe happened, and you're going to see another set of slides when I'm done with this, because what I believe happened is we signed Grace's death certificate for that day when we rejected the ventilator for the 5th time. And I'll connect those dots as we get into the money trail. So if we would have agreed to put Grace on a ventilator, her death date would have just been extended. But they had a financial reason to get her out. And so that's my hypothesis as to why Grace died on October 13th. And you can either agree or disagree with me after you listen to everything. So my wife and I, realizing Grace did have such a good day, so he said she had such a good day, let's get her into a chair, etc. We talked with Jessica. She monitored the oxygen all night long. It was 98, 99%. The night before Grace died, she sat up in her bed. She had a BiPAP mask on, and she hollered to her 2 nephews in the back via a FaceTime call, "Hi, boys." And so, I mean, she was doing, in spite of being sedated. I mean, Jess and I, when we were in the room, we did not know she was sedated. We just thought she's sleepy because, the alarms are going off constantly and she just needs to be caught up on her sleep. But in fact, they were sedating her the whole time. And that becomes the first cause of death. So there's, on the Grace's death certificate, which I'll show you here in a minute, you'll see that there's 2 causes of death listed. Number 1 is acute respiratory failure. And number 2 is COVID-19 pneumonia. The first one is true. The second one is not true. The first one, acute respiratory failure, the hospital received a $7,500 bonus for listing that as a cause of death, which they caused. So Precedex, used for more than 24 hours, I'm going to show you the package insert, causes acute respiratory failure. So it doesn't say it may cause, it does cause if it's used for more than 24 hours. They had it on Grace on that med for 4 full days before her last day. And as I mentioned, during the 44 hours we didn't have advocacy, they increased the dose 7 different times. And you'll see how they got to a dose 14 times here in just a minute. And then just to jump to Grace's death certificate, so you see acute respiratory failure. So they caused the acute respiratory failure from the use of Precedex. And the second cause of death, COVID-19 pneumonia, is a flat lie. But they receive a $13,000 bonus for listing that as a cause of death on the death certificate. You can't make this up. And I'm going to go through the real second and third causes of death. All right, so now Jessica is in the room with Grace. We're done with the phone call with the doctor. There's a nurse that has 14 years of ICU experience in charge of Grace's care her last day. And in fact, she was in charge of Grace's care the day before. That's significant because Grace's death was not a mistake. It wasn't medical negligence. It was, in my opinion, intentional murder. And you'll see why I say that in a moment. So Jessica says to the nurse shortly after we're off the phone with the doctor that she wants to take a shower. That nurse insists that she go home to take a shower. Jessica objects and says, well, when my dad was in the room, you allowed him to shower in the room. And she said, I don't care what we did for your dad. You need to go home. And so she talks with Grace. Grace was prone at this point and lets her know that, hey, I'd like to go home and take a shower. Is that acceptable? Is that okay? Grace acknowledges it, shakes her head. And so then Jess only lives 5 minutes away, so she's back inside of an hour. When she gets back, she overhears the doctor in charge of Grace's care, another doctor, and the 14-year ICU nurse in the hallway as she's gowning up say the family's not going to like this. So she says, what aren't they going to like? Remember, an hour and a half earlier, Grace had such a good day. Okay, an hour and a half later, the family's not going to like this. What aren't they going to like, she asked. Well, we had to restrain Grace while you're gone. So what's the reason? Well, she wanted to get out of the bed and go to the bathroom. And so they strapped my little buddy down to the bed instead of helping her out to go to the bathroom. And they used that as an excuse to increase the dose of Precedex now to 14 times the dose, which is near maximum dose. You'll see at 11:25 they gave her a dose of lorazepam. Not on this slide is at 11:37. They inserted the feeding tube because my wife and I approved this, thinking he tells us that it's, we need to get her organs working, we get, 2, 3, 4 days, Grace is going to be out of the hospital. Well, this was all a blatant lie. So we approved the feeding tube. They didn't start feeding Grace until 1:59, 2 hours and 20 minutes later. That doesn't make any sense. At that point, Grace was knocked out. That's when they start feeding her. At 5:46, another dose of lorazepam. 3 minutes later, another dose. And then at 6:15, they gave her morphine as an IV push. So now in 29 minutes, she had Precedex, lorazepam, morphine. Anybody that's familiar with end-of-life care with hospice patients, that's what they use to take them out at the end of their life. None of us could have survived that drug combination. And this is the second cause of death. And where I get to the point where it's intentional is the doctor had to order those meds. The hospital pharmacist had to sign off. The alarm had to be overridden because these meds are contraindicated according to the morphine package insert. And the 14-year ICU nurse had to make a conscious choice to give my daughter those death meds. So that's the second cause of death, not COVID-19 pneumonia. The third cause of death, so you'll see at 7:20, that's Jessica called Cindy and I on a FaceTime call at home. During that window of an hour and 5 minutes, Grace was getting cold. No doctor or nurse came in the room during this time. In spite of Jessica's pleas, they would not come in the room. The morphine package insert says specifically to keep the reversal drug bedside and monitor the patient. That didn't happen. At 7:20, Jessica called us panicking. She said, "Dad, Grace's numbers are dropping like crazy." I said, "Get the nurses in." She said, "I've been trying, they won't come in." She estimated 30 nurses in the hallway at this point. So Cindy and I start screaming on the FaceTime call, "Save our daughter." They would not come in the room. They hollered back, "She's DNR, do not resuscitate." We found out Tom Renz got involved with our case and hired a medical malpractice nurse. We thought we had all the records. She did a records request. We had received another 1,000 pages. And that's why this title of this presentation is 8 Minutes That Changed Our Life. We found out that after the near max dose of Precedex was put on Grace at 10:48, the doctor put an illegal DNR order on her 8 minutes later. So when we screamed, "Save our daughter," they screamed back, "She's DNR." And we holler, "She's not DNR, save our daughter." They refused. And Jessica had run out in the hallway and they told her, "We can't do anything because of the doctor's DNR." Well, that's a flat out lie. First, the DNR should have never been issued. It's not, the state statute requires either the patient or their advocate to sign the order. Of course, they're supposed to put a bracelet on the patient. So why wouldn't they put a bracelet on Grace? Well, because Jessica's in the room. If they would have put a bracelet on her, it would have taken Jessica about a half a second to call me to say what's going on, and we could have stopped that. So this is all set up Grace's death, which the illegal DNR, of course, is the third cause of death. Before I move into how did this happen, I just want to share that as things settled out that night, Jessica shared with Cindy and I that on top of all of these things that happened, there was an armed guard posted outside of Grace's room. And we presume to not allow any nurse with a conscience to come in and save her. So I'm going to go through, before we really get into how this happened, I want to go through another example. So this first article was written August 17th of 2004. You see it's written by Joel Zivet. I read the whole article, and what this doctor did was he went into a prison system and watched an execution. And you see what he titled it, "The White Coat, A Veil for State Killing." Interestingly, that title could be the title of my presentation today. So this was in 2014. On April 6th of 2020, there was a letter written by a number of doctors to state prison systems requesting execution drugs. And this got reported in a few different news sources on Tuesday the 14th. And this particular news source reports this letter and said that these drugs are used for the death penalty: fentanyl, midazolam, vecuronium, bromide. And I'm going to focus on those three because you think, well, what is going on here? So these doctors requested these drugs. And maybe the most shocking piece, but I want to go through an example, is this is the letter that was written to multiple states' prison systems to request their execution drugs. Look who the first signer of the letter is. I don't think that's any coincidence at all. This is an illegal DNR put on another Down syndrome girl named Megan. So we learned of Megan's story because of Grace's story. Grace's story has gone international, so lots of people are contacting us. And if you look at the detail here, so you'll see that at 8:50, father states they do not want patient to be DNR. Dr. Fox is made aware, plan to speak with family again concerning patient's code status and goal of care. By the way, this is what they do. If you don't accept what they want to do, they keep, it's like, just constant picking at you to get you to agree to the protocol. This is literally, so the father says he doesn't want a DNR. What order is placed? DNR. Totally against the father's will. So this case is exactly parallel to Grace's, except for she was put on a ventilator. Illegal DNR, put on a ventilator, and instead of the 3 drugs used on Grace, Precedex, lorazepam, and morphine, they used fentanyl, milazepam, and vecuronium. The same drugs that were requested from the prison system. So I just received this text from the mom yesterday, and Megan was taken to the hospital. You see on that day was November 17th. She died December 8th. So they kept her in the hospital 22 days, which is the average stay in a hospital if you're on a ventilator. Why? Because that maximizes the financial gain. So on her second to last day, which was December 7th, she received 4 doses of midazolam, 2 doses of fentanyl, and 2 doses of vecuronium. Unbelievably, they also ordered $1,400 worth of food to go down the feeding tube. And you can't make this stuff up. There is such a financial gain by doing this. I want to show you one other thing. So this is from one of the invoices Megan's family received. So this drug I'm highlighting here is tocilizumab. You see it says 800, that's the dose. So 1 dose of tocilizumab, hospital receives $22,000. We were asked to put Grace on tocilizumab day 1. And so I asked the doctor, spell it. And so I researched it and saw that the placebo group did better than the drug group. And so when they came and wanted my decision, I told them that. I said, here's the New England Journal of Medicine article. It shows that placebo group did better. I mean, and they just, the attitude toward me was unbelievable. Ultimately, that was step 1 of many steps that led to me being taken out by an armed guard. So how does this happen? So if you're not familiar with this term banality means common. So banality of evil means evil is so common we don't recognize it. So that's what's going on here. COVID was just an excuse to unleash the banality of evil they've been working on for decades. So I'm just going to buzz through a few examples. So we have disabled abortion culture. If you're not familiar with this, Down syndrome children right now are aborted, murdered, before they're born at the rate in the United States of 67%. So when the young couple goes in to see the doctor, he congratulates them on their pregnancy and says, let's schedule your amniocentesis. So they just accept that, right? Because the lab coat says to do it. So they do the amnio, and if that comes back with any disability whatsoever, even a hint of it, he recommends an abortion. So this becomes the standard of care. These young people have completely checked out. They don't even question it because the doctor is recommending it. So there's no guilt, there's no thought process. That's the banality of evil. So now think about those young people taking care of my daughter Grace and Megan, both with Down syndrome. This isn't about the disabled being taken out, but you'll see as we get into it that they're just the first wave of people taken out in what's happening. The nursing home culture. So what happens now compared to, I'm in the last generation that the kids took care of the parents. Now if mom misses the mail one day, the kids take her to a dementia home. And that's the new standard of care. That's the banality of evil. So again, you think about elderly people getting into the hospital, and then you add in, so on the second to the bottom, I have collectivism. Collectivism means the good of the group versus the good of the individual. So collectivism has replaced the Hippocratic Oath. The Hippocratic Oath is first, do no harm to the individual. Collectivism says, no, we have to worry about the common good. We don't have enough medical care to go around, so we have to ration care. So the useless eaters like Grace and the elderly get taken out in that system. Of course, the public school system has trained out critical thinking completely. And so any of you that know young people that have, remember just when they go to kindergarten, if they make it through the first day, they get a trophy. Well, now when they get out of high school, they don't know how to critically think whatsoever. The state taking the place of the family. Where do our rights come from? Our rights all come from God. They don't come from the state. But they have successfully convinced the masses that our rights come from the government. And if our rights come from the government can now take them away. And then last, moral relativism. I want to just go through this experiment. So where banality of evil came from is Hannah Arendt studied the Adolf Eichmann trial in 1961, and she coined that phrase, banality of evil. She couldn't wrap her head around, how could this happen in Nazi Germany? It doesn't make any sense. And so that's where this idea came from. Well, in 1963, Stanley Milgram did an experiment, and now it's called the Milgram's obedience experiment, to show how can this even happen? In that experiment, he took 20 participants and 20 actors. The actors were all hooked up to electrical leads. Fake. But the participants did not know this. And if they answered a question wrong, they were instructed by the instructor to give the actor a jolt, an electrical shock. If the actor answered 6 questions in a row wrong, which of course that was the design, the electrical shock was enough to kill the actor. 2/3 of the participants were willing to give a shock to kill the actor just for answering questions wrong because they were instructed to do that. So why am I telling you that? Overlay that story with today. So the doctors and nurses, they're instructed if you don't get jabbed, you're going to lose your job. The government is paying an obscene amount of money for the hospitals to follow protocols that kill. And they are instructed to follow these protocols or you will lose your job. So the Milgram obedience experiment was 59 years ago. 2/3 of the participants took enough action to murder the person hooked up to the electrical leads. So what do you think is happening today? The moral culture of our society is substantially worse than 59 years ago. These are, so Grace is on this billboard. We have a local billboard campaign in our area. And so we have several disabled people who have contacted us, and we were fortunate enough to put their faces on the billboard. Megan, the one that I was talking about, is on the right-hand side. All right, why did this happen? So I talked just briefly about the money. So the money trail is significant here. I mentioned about the bonuses that the hospital received for listing what they did on Grace's death certificate. The average amount of money received once somebody is labeled with COVID in a hospital from the government, this is not insurance or private pay, the government bonuses is over $100,000 per COVID patient. To put that into perspective, the government for the first 22 months of COVID paid out $400 billion to hospitals to follow death protocols. And the hospital system that Grace was in was Ascension. Ascension hospital system received $10 billion in bonus money in the first year of COVID. This is hard to fathom. So think through what is going on. There's a shroud of secrecy. We were in the room when they took her out. 99.9% of the people they don't have a loved one in the room. So there's a shroud of secrecy. There's government incentives. And then On top of that, they have immunity from liability. So those three things create a situation where these hospital systems are doing the government's bidding. In Grace's case, my wife saw this early on. She said Grace was worth more dead than alive. And remember I said I think we signed her death certificate to die October 13th because the ICU, her room was classified as ICU because she was on Precedex. There were no ICU beds available in the hospital Grace was in. And there were people in the emergency room that were higher paying, ready to take that bed. So I know that sounds dark, but that's I don't think I'm missing the mark with that. Big picture, what's going on? So people have a hard time grasping that this could happen, but I want to share these numbers because it's mind-blowing. The United States only has 4.3% of the world's population. We're the only country with over 1 million deaths in hospitals related to COVID. So how can that possibly be? The next country in line, so the United States is number 1 in the world. Next country, India. India has just over 500,000 deaths. We have almost 1.1 million. India has 4 times the number of people. Their footprint on the planet is only 1/3 of ours. So what's going on? How can a country with 4 times the number of people have less than half of the deaths? Well, it's because of these protocols. India unleashed ivermectin to their population. What are we doing? We are still continuing, believe it or not, with the protocols of remdesivir, ventilators. Remdesivir has a 75% kill rate, 3 doses and more. Ventilators, a 90% kill rate. That are the only protocols outside of a few, these end-of-life meds and things, but the main protocols the hospitals have to follow to get the bonuses literally kill people. So that's what's going on. So the elderly and the disabled were the first population groups to be taken out in bulk. So in COVID time, the first 2 years of COVID, the number 1 and number 2 causes of death were elderly and disabled. Of course, those are not causes of death because those are not comorbidities. So what's the reason? What's the financial benefit of the government for promoting those deaths? 39% of our annual federal budget goes to Medicare and Medicaid. 2.2 trillion a year goes to Medicare and Medicaid out of the 5.6 trillion annual budget. So there's a financial incentive for the government to take out these 2 population groups. This slide I had to get in before the most recent data, which was just 2 days ago, October 13th. People don't even realize this is still going on. Remember on September 19th, President Biden, he probably didn't say it like I'm doing because he stumbled somehow, I'm guessing, but he announced that the pandemic is over, September 19th. September 20th, so you see I took the numbers from September 20th, we had 28,833 new hospital admissions for COVID the week ending September 20th. So you can see, that's a substantial number. And in fact, the other countries that I have listed had 17,000 fewer hospital admissions in the same week. October 5th, which is roughly the time period where people would die once they're in the hospital, we had 1,085 murders that day. So 1,085 people were murdered like Grace on October 5th, just 2 weeks ago. So is COVID over? Well, October 13th, how they are able to fund this is they have to have a public health emergency. The first public health emergency for COVID was signed under President Trump's administration on January 27, 2020. Every 90 days, they have to extend that by law to keep it going. And on October 13th, they extended it for another 90 days. This is a 2-minute explainer video. So when I say this is just the beginning, I started speaking with a Holocaust survivor about 3 months ago, and her and I are doing interviews together. Her name is Schara, and we put this explainer video together so that people can see that these hospital killings are just one of the angles that is happening now, but there's a lot bigger picture going on.
Do you think complying with government demands will set you free? They told you all you needed to do was wear a mask, social distance, and get an experimental, rushed COVID vaccine with never-before-used mRNA technology, and liberty would be attained. They told you that it was a pandemic of the unvaccinated, but who is really dying and why? While the messages of social isolation, inhibiting your own breathing by masks, and injecting unknown substances into your body was for the greater good. Why is it that those who complied are the ones dying? The freedom you're desperately seeking by complying with government edicts will lead to the ultimate control over every facet of your life. Just as in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, prior to the Holocaust, when Jewish leaders encouraged the Jewish population to obey Nazi orders for their own safety, your compliance will lead to your demise. The first victims under the Nazi regime were disabled children under 3 years old, who were rounded up by nurses professing better care in hospitals, who then murdered them. Eugenics was implemented under the T4 program, which systematically killed the useless eaters through the hands of medical personnel. Currently, the disabled are dying in hospitals at an 11 times greater rate than able-bodied people since COVID began. Grace Schara, who was a 19-year-old with Down syndrome, was killed in 2021 by medical professionals who viewed her life as useless. We are witnessing genocide. Since the jabs were released, deaths have risen above normal levels by as much as 45%. Death benefits were up to $1 billion more in 2021 after the jabs than they were in 2020 when they told us COVID was to blame for all the deaths. You must stop complying. One Holocaust was enough.
So do I look younger on that video? All right, solutions. So there are a number of solutions going on. We're in the hospital lane, and we have resources on Grace's website, and I just put this brief slide together so that at least you have some practical things that you can do, and I want to get into the spiritual aspect in closing. But when I first got woken up, so I would have described myself as a conservative that had a healthy distrust for the government before I was woken up. And I'm just becoming awake now through Grace's death. And the most surprising thing that I found in all of the research, I have over 1,000 hours of research now into Grace's case and all the other things that we researched. And I found out I was personally programmed. So I was programmed to believe the white coat, and that's why my daughter died. If I put all the light on me, my daughter died because I would have never thought in a million years that they would have a goal to kill. But now I'm awake, and what happens is once you become awake, you start becoming disobedient. And I'm not talking about disobedient to God here. I'm talking about disobedient to Satan's plans, which are masks, the jab. It's going to keep getting worse. So I encourage everybody here, do some of your own research, dig, and don't stop. The rest of your life is going to be about waking up. What's coming big in a big way, so the problem, reaction, solution, this is what they always do. So what did they do with problem, reaction, solution with COVID? The problem is COVID, the reaction, fear, the solution, the jab. So that this is the repetitive cycle that the government uses to convince us to fall into their trap. And how do we fight that? We have to have God did not give us a spirit of fear. Doing something with your one talent. God calls us to do something. So all of us have different talents. I mean, we've been given the opportunity to share Grace's story on an international basis. So that's my talent. Yours can be sharing anything that you're learning with your contact list, with your relatives, etc. Do something with your one talent. Don't just keep it to yourself. There's two mistakes that you can make relative to all of this. One is failure to prepare, and you'll see I have some practical things to prepare. But if we rely on our presentations, we rely on our Lord and Savior. That's who we rely on. If we rely on our preparations, we've missed the mark. He expects us to prepare. So what are some things that you can prepare for? Early on, I realized, well, the blood supply is contaminated. And so that link, it's on Grace's website. You'll see practical ways that if you have to get a surgery, that you can prepare ahead of time. Legal documents. You should have your documents in order. You need to have the power of attorneys. You want to make sure that the end of life document that you have for yourself does not include a DNR. Find a source of local care. We're exposed to this website, jointhewedge.com. And there's other places, but I mean, on a national basis, where do you start finding people? But in your local community, you've got to find this stuff out ahead of time. If you end up in the hospital or a loved one ends up in the hospital hostage hotline, this is Dr. Richard Bartlett's sister runs this. We have that link on Grace's website. You have to have advocacy. In the old days, what did advocacy look like? It meant, so being there with Grace, being a buddy with Grace to make sure she's comfortable in the hospital bed, right? A hospital is a place that you can get pretty anxious. You want to have somebody with you. That's the old days of advocacy. The new paradigm with advocacy is you have to be there challenging every single thing. And if one thing does not align with what you know to be right, you have to get your loved one out of there into a hospital that has not been bought with the goal of killing your loved one. So that's the new advocacy paradigm. And we have a couple of advocacy opportunities there. And the most important, preparation. I believe time is urgent. And if you're not right with God, now is the time. If you are right with Him, it's time to get to know the gospel better than you ever have, because people are going to be clamoring for solutions as things progressively get worse. And then Kevin has a note up on the top. Kevin is our PR director. If you want to follow Grace's story, we're doing at least monthly newsletters, ouramazinggrace.substack.com. All right, so you have a question.
Oh, I just wanted to say, when you check into a hospital, you want to ask, especially if COVID's going on, because a friend of mine was in there and his wife was not allowed to visit. And then I had another friend who was up in Lake County in a hospital. He said, come and pick me up and come in my room and carry my stuff down. So why were they letting people in the middle of COVID up in Lake County, but this nice upper crust sort of suburb in the southwest suburb wouldn't let anybody in? So you have to make sure that you can do that. Another thing I wanted to add is my sister had pneumonia and they vented her. And what happens is, and why everyone dies from it, you start choking when they take the tube out and coughing and choking and coughing. They put it back in and they can't wean you off of it. So they just had to let her die because they couldn't get her to stop. And that's what happened. So stay far away from that.
Thank you for sharing. You're right on about different hospitals. So God put me in a different hospital than Grace died at 3 days after she died. And they turned me around in 24 hours. It was St. Vincent Hospital in Green Bay. Grace died at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Appleton. And so I think He put me there so I could objectively tell this story. So you can't, what they did was so far different. Not one thing did they do that was the same. I was on a regular cannula. The nurse came in, so I just about died the first night. And she came in the next morning and had a little pill cup. And she said, I'd like to go through the pill regimen with you. I said, well, what do you have in there? I'm pretty, I'm really very careful at this point. And she says, I have a multivitamin, a probiotic, vitamin D, vitamin C, and fish oil. I said, you gotta be kidding me. And I said, well, you guys don't believe in that stuff. And she said, well, we do here. That was St. Vincent's in Green Bay. So process that. They have a vested interest of getting your diagnosis to be COVID, because that's where the money comes. Okay, so I was diagnosed with COVID, but this hospital system did not buy into the money. And so they treated me with respect. The first night they asked, what do you want to have happen? I said, I don't want any alarms to go off. They respected that. All the alarms were at the nurse's station. In Grace's room, they would not allow that. That was one of the many reasons I was taken out by an armed guard, was challenging the alarms. Yes?
Can't even imagine. I'm really sorry to hear that.
Thank you.
my husband and I, we have 2 sons. Our oldest one is 39. He's autistic. He has mental retardation, probably about a 3 to 5-year-old mentally. He lives in a group home in Joliet. He's there for a few weeks, and then he stays with us at our home for a few weeks. And I know that, with the paperwork for living there, they say if he ever needs to go to the hospital, they'll take him, which in years past always sounded so normal. Now it sounds scary to me. What's the best way to protect him? There are a couple of things we could do. Is there paperwork we need or order we need or something?
That's outstanding. So you have, I assume, guardianship? Okay, so in the guardianship paperwork, and then you would have the medical power of attorney also. Generally, the guardianship attorney would put that paperwork in place. So you should just check it. But remember, paperwork, you can never contract morality. So we had the paperwork in place. So they put a DNR order on Grace's life in spite of the fact that we had the paperwork in place. This is how the liberals operate. They do first. You have a lawsuit that you win 3 years later, but they've already done the damage.
So really, even if
You've
we
got to
had
be there.
even if we had the proper paperwork, they could still do something.
Yeah.
awful.
Well, they're not supposed to, but
yeah.
they're operating outside of the law. Great question. Oh, I'm supposed to stop. All right, we're going to go ahead.
How do you tell the differences in hospitals?
It's, I wish I hadn't.
You know to go to the other one, and I wouldn't know what to do in our area.
It was God's grace that put me there. Interestingly, that hospital that I was there has a driveway that's shared with Bellin Hospital System for their emergency room. It's a shared driveway. And we turned into St. Vincent's instead of Bellin. If we would have turned into Bellin, I wouldn't be here today. So, you can vet them, of course, by asking the questions ahead of time, insisting that you don't get tested for COVID, and then you really have to pay strict attention. But it's got to be done ahead of time. Thank you all for having me. I appreciate it very much.